Hey everyone, it's Scott from certmedia.com, and today I'm going to be discussing PageSpeed Insights. Greatly, everything that's not going to be in the individual breakdown of the lab data. I'm going to be going over what opportunities are, what the diagnostics are, what your score is actually composed of, and what do these numbers actually means anything, and will they change? I'm just going to start right off the bat. Yes, these numbers are all going to change, and it's probably going to be very soon, because Lighthouse has gone through major revisions in its scoring guide, and PageSpeed Insights has failed to keep up. PageSpeed Insights and Lighthouse are both developed by two different teams. Lighthouse is an audit held within Google Chrome. PageSpeed Insights piggybacks off that audit, but it doesn't receive all updates. A big preface: PageSpeed Insights is not used for your Google search ranking. Google does not use the tool at all for determining your ranking in Google search. They're maintained by two separate teams, three separate teams actually when you count the Lighthouse team. And the metric that you see in Search Console does not come from Lighthouse data. It's actually measured using the Chrome User Experience Report, which is data that's anonymously collected. I'm not fully sold that that's used either, but it's supposed to help define if your website has a problem. So now that we have that, let's discuss some of the issues, because there are a lot in PageSpeed Insights versus Lighthouse. Lighthouse version 6 has major differences between its score calculation from PageSpeed Insights, because they all get rapid revisions, because this tool is more in a beta state than it is in publication ready. As you can see, there are also differences in the different scores for different categories: accessibility, SEO, best practices. We're not going to go into those, but here is how PageSpeed Insights works. Currently, the first contentful paint time is only getting a 20% weight. The meaningful paint time is getting 6.7%. So that is this measurement and this measurement. This two compose 26.7%. In Lighthouse, they combine, both of them combined, get a 40% weight. The speed index grade gets 26.7 weight, which is this. In Lighthouse version 6, it's only getting 10. It's been greatly reduced. In the time to interactive is 4 seconds in my case, and it's getting a weight of 33.3%. And in Lighthouse, it's getting a 15% weight. And then there's the first CPU idle time, which is getting a 13.3 weight, and that's not even used anymore, and neither is max potential first input delay. In fact, the FID isn't even calculated currently in your score. This metric is not used at all. It's completely ignored. You can just cover it up. It is not used in the calculation for determining your score. Now, that being said, in Lighthouse, this is not going to be going away, but the metrics are going to be changed. There's going to be a new metric called total blocking time. Total blocking time is just going to be defined as the total amount of time that a page is blocked from responding to user input. It's also going to be getting rid of the first CPU idle time, because it's almost like timed interactive but less accurate. So there's going to be some major changes in these scores. A score of 100 for all these categories is defined as the first meaningful. Here, I'll just open this up side by side for you. So the first contentful paint, the score has to be, to get 100, it has to be 1.3 seconds or lower. The first meaningful has to be 1.35. Okay, so I'm both under that. That means I'm at the max that I can get for these two weighted categories. The speed index has to be 1.9 or lower. But to get a score of 90, you need to be anywhere within the realm of the 23.3 seconds mark. The 2.3 second mark. To get a score of 100 for the speed index, we got to get them 1.9, but you can score anything that's 3,000, so 3.3 seconds or below should get you a green. A interactive time So the time to interactive, anything that's 3.7 seconds or lower should get you into the green. As you can see, I missed it by just a smidge. To get a green for the first CPU idle time, you have to get a 3.5 second or below. Now, remember, all these scores are weighted, which means you're not getting 100% of that category. You could actually get every one of these buttons green, but in theory, not get a perfect score. And that's why if you go to desktop, for instance, I have a 99, but I don't have a 100. And that could be due to any one of these not being a 100% score on their test. And as we said, the max potential first input delay is not calculated in your score. It's completely ignored. So these first 5 metrics are all that compose your PageSpeed Insights score. And these are going to change. The scoring guide has been changed. They've been weighted differently. The Lighthouse team has done research. It's gathered feedback, and it's determining what metrics are ultimately going to matter the most. This is in part why Lighthouse is not being used for your ranking in Google search. I cannot get this into people's heads enough. No particular tool developed by anybody that is publicly accessible is being used to determine what website is fast or not. Now that we've covered the scoring, let's jump into the first 2 categories. Field data and origin summary data are both collected from Chrome user experience reports. They're not generated in the lab, so even if you have your website optimized by a professional or you've done it yourself, these will not directly improve. It's data that's collected over a month, and then it's factored in, and they do some math, and then they generate the data right there for you. This is the data that's shown in Search Console, the field data. The rest of this is not in Search Console. It's completely lab data that's been calculated. Now, opportunities don't directly affect the performance score. What do I mean by that? If let's say you have render blocking CSS, common issue, you can make your CSS files non-render blocking anymore. And PageSpeed Insights could say it could shave 20 seconds off. Let's say you have a very popular here. So this is the CNN website. They currently have all their CSS inlined, which separate issue that should ultimately be ignored. They should be resolved. If they fix this issue to preload this request for this CSS file, this one CSS file that's not even that large, they say they can save 9 seconds by preloading it with a link rel preload. They can add this recommendation, but it will not, or it may not, improve their score. And not all suggestions here are valid. For instance, if you have a off-screen image that's loaded via JavaScript or an advertisement, or it's a image found in your CSS file, you can't lazy load it. It is not possible to lazy load them in traditional manners. Now, the ad network could find a way to lazy load the image, but they're not going to do that. And you're not going to move your background image from your CSS file to loading it inline as an inline style. It just wouldn't make a lot of sense. But you can get false flagged, and you'll almost always get flagged for remove unused CSS. I have 30 kilobytes of CSS on my website, and it's saying I could, in theory, remove 28 kilobytes of CSS. That's not a major amount of CSS, and I'm loading Font Awesome, which I could clean up, Ionicons. I'm loading everything in this CSS file, and they could be cleaned up. And yeah, it's flagging me, and I could say 0.3 seconds. On a 3G connection, 0.3 seconds and 0.15 seconds if this image was resized. This image is getting flagged because it's not being served as a mobile responsive image, so it's not setting a source set attribute that is properly sized for this device that they tested on, which is a Moto G4. The mobile PageSpeed Insights test uses a 3G connection, and it uses a mid-range device, a Motorola G4 for instance, to run its test. It mostly runs on devices that are going to be 1 to $200. They're mid-range devices. They're not too expensive, and they're not what many of you who are probably watching this video have. Like I said when I did the lab data videos, I have a Google Pixel 4, but most users don't have a Google Pixel 4, and they're not running on 4G LTE everywhere they go with a stable connection. So testing it with that is a little bit biased, but depending on your market, particularly if you're in the US, and say you're a small business in a major market, let's say you're a business in like Atlanta, you may not have to worry about people getting a slow 3G connection because chances are they're not going to have a 3G connection. They're going to have a 4G. So it's very market specific. And that's why using Lighthouse to run analysis on 4G connections may ultimately be more reliable depending on your situation. So the lab data, which we went into each of the metrics in depth, keep in mind they are going to be updated when PageSpeed Insights updates to the latest version of Lighthouse. They have no direct input. We went into each one of them. Diagnostics are almost always going to be where you find the actual improvement. It's also going to be the things that marketers hate. If you're a marketer, I'm going to say right now, you're going to get flagged probably with every script that you've ever added to do any sort of tracking in this section. And here's what I mean by that. While it does note that these numbers don't directly affect the performance score, the most obvious things are what directly affect the performance score. In fact, most of these recommendations or diagnostic information that it provides are directly referenced in the guides on how to improve their load time. For instance, it mentions reducing the impact of third-party code. What that means is not loading it. Limit the number of redundant third-party providers, such as if you need analytics data, only load one tracking script. If you're running a pixel, so let's say you're running Facebook ads, or you were running one of Facebook ads and stopped, remove the script if it's not being used. Loading redundant code to get the same information multiple ways isn't doing yourself any favors. Try to stick with one, maybe two providers at most for your tracking needs to get the data that you need. But if you're loading 4 or 5, and I see this all the time with tracking scripts, to get all the data that's almost telling you the exact same thing, you're not doing yourself any favors. Also, your live chat widgets are going to end up in here. Your use of Google Maps are going to end up in here. Anything that doesn't come from your domain, so in my case, anything that doesn't come from serpmedia.com is a third-party asset, and it's almost always going to be flagged in here once it reaches its threshold. And the threshold isn't that much. I believe it's around 300 milliseconds. It is not a very high threshold. So on CNN's case, because this isn't my website, on their mobile, it's flagging everything. Everything's on here. Pretty much everything. Their ads, their tracking scripts, the redirects from those ads to other pages for the tracking scripts, it's all been flagged. And it says that if it was all removed, they could free up the main thread time by 5,000 milliseconds. Part of the issue with all the diagnostics information is it's incredibly unreliable. It's synthetic. And what I mean by that is it's a best guess at the real impact at the time that the measurement was taken. And there are actual means that this data is collected and measured, but it's not a gold standard, if you would. So it can say that you can save 5,000 milliseconds by removing all these services. I'm willing to bet if they removed all these services and only loaded their CSS and their JS from CNN.com, it would load nearly instantaneously. And it mentions ensure the main text remains visible. Ensure text remains visible during web font load. What this means is you're adding a font display swap property, which allows the browser to fall back to a system safe font. So think of Times New Roman, it's not every system ever. It will fall back to that font, and once the web font file is downloaded by the browser, it will swap and display that. So you'll have a flash of unstyled text, but you won't have a flash of invisible text. Invisible text is much worse than unstyled text, because if the user doesn't get feedback that text is loading and it takes a while for it to download, they may think that there's an issue with the website or their internet, and the bounce rate is going to increase. It's better that they get served something in their face faster than to be served nothing, even if it's not the style that you want. And you might be quick, well, I'm just going to serve them faster. Serving fonts faster is not that simple. Most people make the mistake using the web font loader, which was great when it came out. I would not recommend it much anymore. Preloading fonts is good, but if you load too many fonts, then you're hurting the rest of your website's load time. And a lot of WordPress websites I run into, they load a monstrous amount of web fonts, and they load every character in said web font, when you only need to load really the characters that you're working with. On my website, my Google font files, I load only the English characters, A, B, C, D, through Z, the numbers, and the most common keys that I'm going to use. So question mark, period, comma. I think I have a heart for a little something I have in my footer of my website. Only the most common characters that I'm actually going to be serving, and that's it. The sheer amount of characters in Unicode really makes you seem, you'll be shocked on the amount of savings that you can get from a single font file just by cutting out all the useless characters. And it might seem overkill, but it really does help getting text in front of users at a faster rate. Reducing the JavaScript execution time. Delivering smaller JavaScript payloads, which means a lot of files in smaller packages, can help reduce this. And most of the times it doesn't, because most of the times all the JS is either not being used or it's being used, but it's not being used right away, so you can defer it anyways. You won't be able to reduce JavaScript execution just by minifying it and slapping a caching plugin on the solution or adding a CDN. It's not that simple. It would almost always take rewriting it or really just getting rid of it. Making do with less is more important, is the key to PageSpeed Insights. And it's not something that they really suggest outside of the remove unused CSS warning, but that warning can be easily bypassed. You don't see it being flagged on CNN.com, and the reason for that is it doesn't detect CSS that's inlined. All of CNN.com has its CSS inlined, which is actually a detriment to their overall performance, because for repeat visitors, I'm not able to save that CSS, so I have to now re-download all that CSS in the doc on every page that I go to on repeat. So repeat visitors don't get a good time. And a lot of people who go to CNN.com tend to visit it multiple times in a day even. And they have to re-download those resources, and it's a trick for the test. And this touches on the next issue that people run into, is minimize main thread workup, which is just the exact same thing as JavaScript execution time. In fact, if you read this warning, it's exactly the same warning, more or less. Consider reducing the time spent parsing, compiling, and executing JS. Compiling, parsing, and executing JS. You may find delivering smaller JS helps with JavaScript execution time, but it says the exact same thing for the main thread workup. It's not a good recommendation, because even if you serve it in smaller payloads, too much JavaScript is too much JavaScript. Serving a bunch of complicated sliders, the most common slider that I run into is revolution slider. And having a single revolution slider on your page can be the difference of 20 plus points on PageSpeed Insights Mobile, even if you optimize the images, even if you've lazy loaded the sub slides, because it's not the images that are slowing it down, it's the JavaScript. JavaScript's expensive for mobile devices to parse and execute because it consumes a lot of CPU time, and their CPUs aren't good because they're phones. Now again, if you're running a top of the line device like I am, you're not going to notice it, but somebody who's maybe a teenager, maybe somebody who just doesn't have a very expensive phone and is running a mid-range device, as this test assumes, or has a really slow connection, they're going to notice the impact of all those assets. So the ultimate impact on PageSpeed Insights is going to be you have to make do with less. You have to think about everything that you're sending to the users. You'll sometimes get flagged. Most of these warnings are not going to matter too much, but we've covered the following: the JavaScript execution, main thread, basically the same warning with different times. Adding font display swap will resolve this issue. Reducing the impact of third-party code, which is just a nice way of saying get rid of it. Serving a static cache, serve static assets with an efficient cache policy just means adding expires headers for an extended period of time. Most of the time you can just do a year for your assets and it's fine. Avoid an excessive DOM size. The only way to have a smaller DOM size is to have a less complicated page layout or to write better code. If you're using a page builder, you're not really going to be able to write more efficient code. You'll just have to add less attributes. Removing an attribute from the page, whether it's a slider, a carousel, or a collection of images you have, will greatly reduce the load time because the browser doesn't have to do long, complicated style calculations and do reflows as it gets down to the rest of the page. So having less complicated page layouts with less elements is how you reduce the DOM size. And these recommendations are general advice. If you're a developer who has much experience with this, you'll know that there are other things that can be done, but we also have to look at the things that everyone can do. Avoid enormous network payloads. Large network layouts cost users real money. Effectively, if your page size is too large, you're going to get flagged with this warning. And it's going to list out the largest items on the page. CNN is basically getting flagged with all ads and React.js. Again, you can minify the assets. You can serve them more efficiently. Instead of using GIFs, you could try to serve them as MP4s. The issue you're going to run into with that, though, is GIFs to MP4s can cause colors to be misrepresented. So you may have a complicated GIF that when converted to MP4, maybe you have colors that are mistaken or other styling mistakes that are now messed up with the image, causing it to not be effective. Now, if you're using an animated GIF for anything that's going on the page in 2019, that's just shameful, but it's common and it's a real issue. So just think of the assets that you're sending, making sure they're minified and they're served in the most efficient format. For images, try WebP. For GIFs, try video. For CSS, make sure you're compressing. JS, make sure you're compressing. Your HTML, make sure you're compressing just to keep your bytes low. Try lazy loading assets if possible. Use your timing marks and measures. This is never going to apply to your specific user interface, but you can use the user timing API to measure your app's performance during key user experiences. You'll only ever get really flagged for this if you're using some kind of tracking script. The most common one would be Hotjar that you could get flagged for, and you can ignore this. There's nothing that you can particularly do on your side. If you're somebody who wrote the timing and measures script, then you were looking for that exact answer, you're gonna need to read the docs. It's quite in-depth. To keep request counts low and transfer size small. Request counts do matter, and you want to keep your transfer size also low. So this is CNN's mobile case. They're getting a transfer size of 114 JavaScript files that are totaling 3.8 megs. And those are assets that it determines are just script files. So there's more JS being transferred than there are images. That's why everything is so high on this page, is the main thread effectively has no time to breathe. Font files, they're serving 10 fonts files that are equaling 354 kilobytes. Serving your font files as WAF2 can greatly reduce the file size because it's going to be compressed, but also reducing the amount of characters in those font files, which is very advanced, and the only effective way of doing it is with Google Fonts. We'll also reduce the transfer size. The document is going to be the HTML. Looks like there's many of them, possibly iframes in here. Minifying your HTML and having less HTML will reduce the document size. Media, which is going to be your videos. Just make sure you're serving compressed videos. Your style sheets, making sure you're compressing your style sheets. Your third-party assets, if it's third-party, you can't touch them because they're not yours. One thing to note is third-party includes any and all of these other metrics. So the total transfer size was 5 kilobytes. But third-party and script, if you add them together, are going to be over 7 kilobytes, 7,000 kilobytes. And the reason for this is third-party is just a total representation of everything that's third-party and what it's loading. So you could easily equate 370 of the total request count coming from third-party assets, mostly JavaScript and ad networks. That's why the total number of requests is going to be about 50 from assets originating from CNN.com. And there's a bunch of other audits that I'll briefly touch on. Eliminate render blocking resources. Make sure you have no render blocking style sheets. Don't just inline all of your style sheets. That is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. You'll regret it, and everybody who visits your website is just going to be plagued by a slower experience because you did that. Load them in a critical fashion where the critical CSS is inlined and the CSS is loaded in a non-render blocking fashion. Make sure your images are resized and they're not being served too large for their container size. For the minify CSS, make sure your CSS both inline and in files are being minified. JavaScript, same story. Removing unused CSS. Removing unused CSS is important. Now, my website gets flagged for this, even though I have a lot less potential savings, and there's a reason for this. Here, past audits on mine. Let me go to mobile. Remove unused CSS. It seems to only flag CSS that is loaded in a file. The CNN website has a large chunk of CSS inlined in the document, and that doesn't get flagged for a variety of warnings for some reason or another. I'm not fully sure why that is, but it doesn't seem like it gets flagged, even though it should, and it is a concern, and it should be in their opportunities. Or maybe the test is just determining that their other opportunities are the real issue, and those are what they should fix. Then there is efficiently encode images. So serving images in the correct format. So serving JPEGs as optimized, removing any extraneous data, metadata particularly, and anything else that's not pixel related should be removed. That should just be done from all images. And all images should just be losslessly compressed as they're uploaded to your website, particularly if you're on WordPress. Just install something like Image Optimizer and have it compress your images on upload. Preconnect required origins. This is using DNS Preconnect or DNS Prefetch or the Preconnect header, which is the resource hint to tell the browser to, in the case of Preconnect, think of it as opening up a new lane on a road to allow the assets to be delivered to it, and it's already waiting and ready for it, as opposed to going down the highway with everybody else. DNS Prefetch, well, when the browser is accessing the page, it'll go out and prefetch DNS requests that it knows it's going to need. This can help deliver some third-party assets. First, it's on my website. I'm using Ionicons, and I'm loading it from a third-party CDN. I'm going to fix that later. But if I want to help make that faster, I can prefetch that third-party CDN, which would greatly improve its delivery speed because it doesn't need to perform the prefetch at the time that it's downloading the file. So I would just want to add, as you can see, it's fonts.googleapis.com for the Google fonts, or I have unpackage.com, which I have prefetched, and it's for the CSS file located here. Server response times are slow. Make sure that your TTFB is under, it's flagged. It gets flagged if it's anything over 600 milliseconds, regardless of platform. I typically recommend that your TTFB should be under 300 milliseconds. specifically if you're testing near where your server is. So if your server is in Chicago, like where mine is, and I test from Dallas, Texas on GT Matrix or Pingdom, you would want the TTFB to be less than 300 milliseconds if possible. Now, obviously on a mobile device, that's harder, which is why there's such a large gap. One thing that you should note is when you get flagged with the reduced TTFB warning is you'll get flagged by, if you say your TTFB is 700 milliseconds, it'll flag it as 100 milliseconds, but that's actually the measurement for the amount of time that you're over the 600 milliseconds flag. So if you get flagged for 0.1 second, that's not how long the measurement is, that's how much you are over the 600 millisecond cap. My website is loaded from the CDN at the edge, so it's loading at around like 100 to 200 milliseconds everywhere. Avoid multiple page redirects. The easiest thing that you should do here, just to get a consistent testing result, is test it from the URL that appears in the address bar, or else you're always going to get flagged with this. So mine is https www.certmedia.com. If I put it as certmedia.com with HTTP, it's going to flag me because now it's getting redirected. Just avoid testing the incorrect URL. And then you get used video formats for animated content. Animated content being the GIFs. Consider using WebMPEG-4 or WebM. There's also APNG, which is animated PNG. I wouldn't use it. Nobody really seems to be using it. It hasn't caught on. And it's best to use PNG and WebP for static images instead of GIF. GIF is just a really inefficient format. It was great, and it's still great for sharing memes over Facebook Messenger. But outside of that, you should never use it on your website. It's a grossly inefficient means of transferring data. A 1.2 megabyte, I actually compressed one earlier, a 1.2 megabyte MP4 file can come out to be, I think it was around 100 or so kilobytes. So it's a fraction, it's a 1/10 or so of the size of the GIF for effectively the same content. And so long as you hide the controls instead of to autoplay on loop, it's effectively a GIF. And then finally, there is the avoid chaining of critical requests. So the critical request chain, as it mentions below, show you what resources are loaded with a high priority, considering reducing the length of chains, reducing the download side of resources, or deferring the downloaded of unnecessary resources. So this is on the CNN. I'm going to go to mine. I have 4 chains. So it goes to certmedia.com, which is the initial navigation. For strangely enough, it goes initial navigation for me, and then it goes to like down. I don't understand why it does that myself, but the CNN one is flagged down there for some reason. So it goes, and then it immediately connects to the WAF2 file for Ionicons, which is quite odd to me. And then it goes and connects to the WAF2 file for my Google font, which is also being served locally. And then it seems to be downloading my old WAF2 file still for Ionicons, which is not updated yet. And then it's downloading another Google font. So reducing the number of requests like this can greatly go a long way. It also looks like it got hung up on one Google font request. I think it took around 540 milliseconds for a 16 kilobyte file, which is very much below its download speed. So reducing the number of these requests or loading them, for instance, toward the bottom or not preloading them, can have a much better user experience. I have the Google fonts forced to be inlined, so they're downloaded immediately to allow the text to swap in. The text is loaded with font display swap, which allows the browser to show a fallback text until it's downloaded to give a decent user experience, even though the font has to be downloaded. It'd be best if I used a system font, but I like the way these fonts look. Web design, it gets everybody at least one way. Otherwise, just loading assets in the most efficient manner possible is what you're going to have to do. You're going to want to reduce the amount of critical requests. The CNN loads their icons, a tracking JS, it looks like, I feel like this request chain actually got interrupted because it says the maximum critical path latency was 3680 milliseconds while mine was 990. Mine adds up much closer than theirs does. Quite odd. But just reduce the amount of assets that are necessary. Defer your JavaScript. Load only what's necessary with a high priority. Loading with preload is the same as requesting as high priority. I don't need to load my ion icons with a high priority because they're not necessary for most user experience. I could instead load it in the footer if I would like, which would allow it to be downloaded at a lower priority and get a better user experience for everybody in the end, which is an issue I have to fix. What CNN would have to do is load the WAV file with a lower priority, but it seems to be their major icon font used everywhere, so that could definitely negatively impact user experience. The best thing they could do is reduce their document transfer size, which is 150 kilobytes compressed, and that would go a long way. Otherwise, that's basically everything you need to know about PageSpeed Insights. If you have any questions about it, you can ask me in the below. A quick recap: no, PageSpeed Insights is not used for your ranking. If you've been told that, you're wrong. Maintained by an entirely different team using Lighthouse statistics, which are both out of date, and Lighthouse is maintained by another team. The data that's used in Search Console now for your speed does not come from PageSpeed Insights. It comes from the Chrome User Experience Report, which is the same thing as the field data and origin summary data that appears on PageSpeed Insights. Not every thing that you get flagged for on PageSpeed Insights is fixable, and even if it is fixable, it may not be recommended. Sometimes preloading a font or a file that it asks you to can negatively impact the load time for the rest of the website. That's why every suggestion is to be taken with a grain of salt. Another note is not everything and the opportunities, let alone to be fixable, will impact your score. And diagnostics, while these things can impact your score greatly, most of the time they involve removing something from your website, particularly third party. So like I said, if you have any questions, you can ask me in the comment section below. If I haven't hit on anything important, I can make a follow-up video, or I can just answer in the comments below and make a little pinned comment. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.